Hey everyone, welcome back to the Midnight Library. Tonight we're settling in for something a little different, a little older, and perhaps a little quieter than you might expect. We're going to explore the entire story of Norse mythology, from the very first moment before time had a name, all the way through to the end of everything and what comes after. This is a journey measured not in miles, but in ages, in the slow turning of worlds, in the patient growth of a tree that holds all of existence in its branches. So before we begin, take a moment to like this video if you enjoy what we do here, and subscribe if you'd like more of these calm historical journeys. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I always find it fascinating to see who joins us from around the world. Now settle in, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the quiet wash over you. We have a long road ahead, and there's no need to rush. Norse mythology is the collection of stories, beliefs, and traditions that belong to the people of Scandinavia during what we now call the Viking Age, roughly from the late 8th century through the 11th century, though its roots reach back much further into the mists of the pre-Christian Germanic past. These myths were never written down by the people who first believed them. They were shared around fires, whispered in the long northern nights, woven into poems and songs that passed from one generation to the next, carried by memory and voice alone. The world those stories described was vast and strange, filled with gods and giants, elves and dwarfs, dragons and serpents, all bound together by fate, and threaded through with a sense that even the gods themselves were not eternal, that everything, no matter how powerful, would one day come to an end. What we know today about Norse mythology comes primarily from two main sources, both written down in Iceland in the 13th century, long after the old gods had been officially replaced by Christianity. The first is called the Poetic Edda, a collection of anonymous Old Norse poems that were copied into a manuscript known as the Codex Regius, which means royal book, around the year 1270. These poems are older than the manuscript itself, composed in an earlier time and preserved through oral tradition before someone finally set them down in ink. The second source is the Prose Edda, written around the year 1220 by an Icelandic scholar, poet, and politician named Snorri Sturluson. Snorri's work is part mythology handbook, part argument for preserving the old stories, and part instruction manual for poets who wanted to understand the traditional metaphors and references that filled Old Norse poetry. He drew heavily on the poems of the Poetic Edda and other sources that have since been lost, and his Prose Edda remains the most complete and detailed single source we have for Norse mythology today. It's important to understand that what survives is only a fragment. The poems and stories were filtered through the minds of Christian scribes who lived centuries after the beliefs they described had faded. Some details were changed, some were forgotten, and some were deliberately reshaped to fit the new religion or the tastes of medieval audiences. What we have is a reconstruction, a careful piecing together of clues from poetry, from Snorri's prose, from scattered references in other medieval texts, from inscriptions on stones, and from archaeological evidence that hints at rituals and beliefs that were never fully explained in words. Scholars have spent generations debating what is authentic and what is invention, what reflects ancient belief and what is Snorri's own creativity. But even with these uncertainties, the stories that have come down to us are rich and strange and full of a particular northern clarity, a willingness to look at the world without blinking, to acknowledge that beauty and terror, order and chaos, life and death are all bound together, inseparable and eternal. Before we meet the gods, before we walk the worlds, we need to understand how it all began. And in the beginning, according to the Norse, there was nothing. Or rather, there was Ginnungagap, the yawning void, the great emptiness that stretched between two distant realms. On one side of the void lay Niflheim, the land of ice and mist and cold, a place of frozen rivers and endless winter. On the other side was Muspelheim, the land of fire, a realm of heat and flame and burning light. These two places existed before anything else, and they stood at opposite ends of creation, separated by the emptiness of Ginnungagap. Time passed, if time can be said to exist in a place where nothing lives and nothing changes. And eventually, the heat from Muspelheim began to reach across the void, creeping toward the ice of Niflheim. Where fire met ice, the ice began to melt, and from that melting, from the meeting of opposites, came the first drops of water, the first thaw in the endless freeze. Those drops gathered and took shape, and from them emerged the first living being in all of creation, a giant named Ymir. Ymir was huge, ancient, and alone, a creature of frost and chaos, the ancestor of all the giants who would come after him. As the ice continued to melt, another being appeared, a great cow named Audumla, who had no voice and no story beyond her function. She fed Ymir with her milk, 4 rivers of it that nourished the giant and allowed him to survive in the cold void. And while Ymir slept, strange things happened. From the sweat of his armpits, other giants were born, male and female, and his legs, restless in sleep, entwined with one another and produced yet another giant. These were the first generations of the Jotnar, the race of giants who would populate the wild places of the world and stand in opposition to the gods who were yet to come. But Audumla the cow had her own role to play. She was hungry, and so she licked at the salty blocks of ice that surrounded her in the frozen void. On the first day of her licking, a tuft of hair appeared in the ice. On the second day, a head emerged. And on the third day, a full man stepped free, tall and strong and handsome. His name was Beri, and he was the first of the gods, or at least the first ancestor of the gods, born not from parents but from ice and salt and the patient work of a cow's tongue. Beri had a son named Bor, and Bor married a giantess named Bisla, who was the daughter of a giant named Burlthorn. From this union between god and giant came 3 sons, 3 brothers who would change everything. Their names were Odin, Vili, and Ve, and they would become the first true gods, the ones who would take the raw chaos of Ginnungagap and shape it into a cosmos. The brothers looked at Ymir, the great frost giant who lay sleeping in the void, and they made a decision. Ymir was too powerful, too chaotic, too dangerous to be allowed to continue, and so they killed him. The act was brutal and necessary, a first murder that would set the pattern for all the violence and struggle that would follow. When Ymir died, his blood poured out in such torrents that it drowned almost all of the giants who had been born from him. Only one giant and his family managed to escape, climbing onto a makeshift boat and fleeing across the flood of blood to safety. From that survivor, all the later generations of giants would descend, carrying with them a deep and ancient grudge against the gods who had murdered their ancestor. Odin and his brothers did not waste Ymir's body. They dragged the giant's massive corpse into the middle of Ginnungagap and set to work, transforming death into creation. From Ymir's flesh, they made the earth, the solid ground that would become the land where humans and animals would walk. From his blood, they made the seas and lakes and rivers, the waters that would surround and define the world. From his bones, they shaped the mountains, great jagged peaks that rose into the sky. From his teeth and broken bone fragments, they made stones and rocks, the hard foundations of the world. From his hair, they created the trees and forests, filling the new world with green and growing things. And from his skull, they fashioned the sky itself, lifting it high above the earth and setting it in place, held aloft by 4 dwarfs who stood at the cardinal directions, their names east, west, north, and south. Even Ymir's brains were not wasted. The brothers took them and scattered them into the sky, and they became the clouds, drifting and shifting overhead, soft and grey and ever-changing. And from the sparks and embers that flew out of Muspelheim, the realm of fire, they made the stars and the sun and the moon, setting them into the heavens to mark the passage of time and light the world below. To the new earth they gave a name. They called it Midgard, which means middle enclosure or middle yard, because it lay in the center of the cosmos, protected and fenced in. Around the edge of Midgard, the brothers placed Ymir's eyebrows as a protective wall, a barrier to keep the dangerous giants at bay. Beyond that wall, to the east and north, lay Jotunheim, the land of the giants, a wild and untamed place of mountains and forests and cold, where the descendants of the surviving giant made their homes and nursed their resentment of the gods. But Midgard was not yet complete. It had land and sea and sky, but it had no people. One day, as Odin and his brothers walked along the seashore, they found 2 trees, or perhaps 2 pieces of driftwood washed up on the beach. Some sources say the trees were an ash and an elm. The brothers saw potential in these lifeless forms, and they decided to create something new. Odin gave the trees breath and life. Vili gave them consciousness and the power to move. And Ve gave them faces and speech and hearing and sight. The 2 trees became the first humans, a man and a woman. The man was named Ask, and the woman was named Embla. From them, all of humanity would descend, living out their lives in Midgard, the world that the gods had made from a giant's corpse in the center of creation. The gods, meanwhile, needed a home of their own. High above Midgard, they built a realm called Asgard, a place of great halls and high walls, shining and beautiful, the seat of divine power and order. Asgard was connected to Midgard by a bridge, a shimmering arc of light and color that spanned the gap between the world of gods and the world of humans. This bridge was called Bifrost, and it is often described as a rainbow, though it was stronger than any rainbow, and it was guarded by a god named Heimdall, who could see for 100 miles by day or night, and hear the grass growing in the meadows and the wool growing on sheep. Bifrost allowed the gods to travel down to Midgard whenever they wished, to watch over humanity and involve themselves in mortal affairs. But it was fragile, too, and it was prophesied that one day it would break under the weight of invading forces, shattered in the final battle that would bring the age of gods to an end. And so the cosmos took shape. From nothing, from ice and fire and the death of a giant, the gods created a world. But they did not create only one world. The cosmos they built was vast and complex, a structure of many realms, each with its own inhabitants, its own character, its own place in the order of things. And holding all of these worlds together, connecting them and sustaining them, was a tree. Its name was Yggdrasil, and it was no ordinary tree. Yggdrasil was the world tree, an ash so vast that its branches reached into the heavens and its roots plunged deep into the underworld. It was the axis around which all of creation turned, the spine of the cosmos, the framework that gave structure to existence itself. The name Yggdrasil can be translated roughly as Odin's horse, a strange name for a tree, until you understand that in Norse tradition, the gallows were sometimes called a horse, and Odin, seeking wisdom, once hanged himself from the tree for 9 days and nights, riding it as a man rides a horse, suffering and starving until the secrets of the runes were revealed to him. The tree was sacred, ancient, and alive, and its health was the health of the cosmos. Yggdrasil had 3 great roots, and each root reached into a different realm. One root extended to Asgard, the home of the gods, and beneath it lay a well called Urdarbrunna, the Well of Fate. By this well lived 3 women known as the Norns, whose names were Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld, which can be understood as what was, what is, and what will be. The Norns were not gods, and they were not subject to the gods. They were older and more fundamental, weavers of fate who decided the destinies of every living being, god and giant and human and elf, spinning the threads of lives and cutting them when the time came. Every day, the Norns drew water from the Well of Fate and mixed it with the soil around the tree, pouring it over Yggdrasil's roots to keep the tree healthy and strong. Without their care, the tree would wither, and if the tree withered, all the worlds would fall into chaos. The second root of Yggdrasil reached into Jotunheim, the land of the giants, and there it rested above a well called Mimisbrunna, the Well of Wisdom. This well was guarded by a being named Mimir, who was said to possess immense knowledge. Odin himself came to this well seeking wisdom, and Mimir demanded a price, one of Odin's eyes. Odin paid it without hesitation, plucking out his own eye and casting it into the well, and in return he drank from the waters and gained the knowledge he sought. From that day forward, Odin was known as the One-Eyed God, a wanderer who had sacrificed much for understanding. The third route reached down into Niflheim, the realm of ice and mist that had existed since before the creation of the world. Beneath this route lay a spring called Yggdrasil, the roaring cauldron, from which many rivers flowed. This was a place of cold and darkness, and it was gnawed constantly by a dragon named Nidhogg, a serpent who chewed at the root of Yggdrasil, trying to weaken the tree and bring it down. Nidhogg was not alone in this work. Many other serpents coiled around the roots in the depths, biting and tearing, their venom dripping into the dark waters below. The trunk of Yggdrasil rose through the center of the cosmos, and on its bark lived a variety of creatures. There was a squirrel named Ratatoska who ran up and down the tree, carrying insults between Nidhogg at the roots and a great eagle that perched at the very top of the tree. The eagle sat in the highest branches, surveying the worlds below, and between its eyes sat a hawk named Vedafalnir, whose purpose is not entirely clear, but who watched and waited all the same. 4 stags also roamed through the branches of Yggdrasil, nibbling at the leaves and buds, their names Dane, Dvalin, Dunirand, and Durathra. They too damaged the tree, though perhaps not with malice, simply by feeding on it as animals must. Yggdrasil was under constant assault. The dragon chewed its roots, the stags ate its leaves, and rot and decay worked at its wood from within. Yet the tree endured, tended by the Norns, nourished by the well of fate, standing firm as the pillar that held all the worlds in place. It was said that Yggdrasil trembled sometimes, and when it did, the worlds shook. And it was prophesied that at the end of all things, when the final battle came, Yggdrasil would shake and groan, but even then it would not fall. The tree was stronger than the world, older than the gods, and more enduring than fate itself. The tree supported 9 worlds, 9 distinct realms that made up the full extent of Norse cosmology. The precise identity of these 9 worlds is a matter of some debate, because the sources do not always agree, and Snorri Sturluson, writing in the 13th century, sometimes imposes a structure that may not have been original to the myths themselves. But certain realms appear again and again in the sources, and their names and natures are clear enough to describe. First and foremost was Asgard, the home of the Aesir, the gods who ruled the heavens and governed the affairs of gods and men. Asgard was a place of order, law, and justice, or at least the gods' version of justice, which did not always match human ideals. It was a realm of great halls, each god having a dwelling of their own. Odin's hall was called Valaskjalf, and within it stood his throne, Hlidskjalf, from which he could see into all the 9 worlds and know what was happening everywhere at once. Another famous hall in Asgard was Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, where Odin gathered warriors who had died bravely in battle. These warriors, called the Einherjar, feasted and fought in Valhalla, preparing for the day when they would be called to fight in the final battle at the end of the world. Not all warriors went to Valhalla. Half of those who died in battle were claimed by the goddess Freyja and taken to her hall, Sessrumnir, which lay in a place called Folkvanga, also within the bounds of Asgard. Asgard was protected by a great wall built by a mysterious giant with the help of his powerful horse, though that is a story for another time. The gods lived in splendor and strength, but they were not without fear, for they knew that their world would not last forever. Below Asgard, connected by the rainbow bridge Bifrost, lay Midgard, the world of humans, the Middle Earth, the realm that the gods had made from Ymir's body and gifted to Ask and Embla and their descendants. Midgard was a place of farms and forests, oceans and mountains, a world of short-lived creatures who struggled and loved and died and were remembered or forgotten according to their deeds. The gods took an interest in Midgard, sometimes helping and sometimes harming, walking among humans in disguise or sending signs and omens. Thor in particular was seen as a protector of Midgard, using his great hammer to fight off the giants who threatened the world of men. To the east and north of Midgard lay Jotunheim, the land of the Jötnar, the giants. Jotunheim was a realm of wilderness and chaos, of mountains and deep forests and cold rivers, a place that stood in contrast to the order of Asgard and Midgard. The giants were not simple monsters. They were ancient, powerful, and often wise, and many of them had connections to the gods through marriage or kinship. Some giants were enemies of the gods, but others were allies or lovers or parents of gods. The relationship between Asgard and Jotunheim was complex, marked by both conflict and cooperation, enmity and intimacy. To the west or south, depending on the source, was Vanaheim, the home of the Vanir, another group of gods who were distinct from the Aesir. The Vanir were associated with fertility, prosperity, and the natural world, with the growth of crops and the wealth of the sea. At some point in the distant past, the Aesir and the Vanir went to war, the first war in the history of the world. The war ended in a stalemate, and the two groups made peace by exchanging hostages. The Vanir sent some of their greatest members to live in Asgard, including Njord, the god of the sea, and his children Freyr and Freyja. In return, the Aesir sent gods to Vanaheim, though the details of this exchange are not entirely clear in the sources. After the exchange, the distinction between Aesir and Vanir became less important, and they were often spoken of together as simply the gods. There was Ulfheim, the world of the elves, beings of light and beauty who are mentioned often but described rarely in the surviving sources. The light elves, or Eldjosulfar, lived in Ulfheim and were said to be fairer than the sun. It was given to the god Freyr as a gift when he was still a child, and he ruled over it from Asgard. Little else is known about the elves, except that they seem to have been connected to the gods and to the natural world, spirits or minor deities whose exact nature has been lost to time. Beneath the earth lay Svartalfheim, sometimes called Nidavellir, the realm of the dwarfs. The dwarfs were master craftsmen, skilled beyond measure in the working of metal and stone and magic. They lived in caves and underground halls, and they created many of the gods' greatest treasures, including Thor's hammer Mjolnir, Odin's spear Gungnir, and the golden hair of the goddess Sif. The dwarfs were born from the flesh of Ymir, emerging like maggots from the dead giant's body, and the gods gave them shape and consciousness. They were sometimes called dark elves, or Svartalfar, and they were as different from the light elves as night from day. There was Niflheim, the ancient realm of ice and mist that had existed since before the world began. Niflheim was a place of cold and darkness, and within it lay Hel, the land of the dead. Hel was ruled by a goddess of the same name, a daughter of Loki who had been cast down into the underworld by Odin. Those who did not die in battle, those who died of sickness or old age or accident, went to Hel when they died. It was not necessarily a place of torment, but it was cold and dim and distant from the world of the living. The goddess Hel is described as half living and half dead, her body divided down the middle, one side beautiful and the other side rotting. And there was Muspelheim, the realm of fire that had also existed since the beginning, a land of heat and flame guarded by a being named Surtur, a fire giant who carried a flaming sword. Surtur and his kin would remain in Muspelheim until the end of days, and then they would march forth to burn the world. These 9 worlds, or some combination of them depending on how one counts and defines them, were the full extent of the Norse cosmos. They were arranged on Yggdrasil like ornaments on a tree, each occupying its own place, each connected to the others through the branches and roots of the great ash. Gods could travel between the worlds, and so could giants and dwarfs and certain heroes and witches who knew the secret paths. But for most beings, the world they were born in was the world they would die in, and the other realms were distant and strange, places of legend and rumor. Now that we have the stage, we can begin to meet the actors. The gods of Norse mythology are not distant, perfect beings who dwell in eternal bliss. They are flawed, complicated, passionate, and mortal in their own way. They scheme and fight and love and make mistakes, and they know, or at least some of them know, that they are doomed, that the future holds their destruction, and there is nothing they can do to prevent it. This sense of inevitable fate, of weird, hangs over the myths like a northern winter, cold and inescapable. The gods were divided into two main families, the Aesir and the Vanir, though as we have seen, the line between them blurred after their war and the exchange of hostages. The Aesir were the gods of power, war, kingship and poetry, and they made their home in Asgard. The Vanir were gods of fertility, wealth and the sea, and they came from Vanaheim. Together, they formed the pantheon that the Norse people worshipped and told stories about, and their relationships with one another and with the other inhabitants of the 9 worlds form the heart of the mythology. Let us begin with Odin, for he is the foremost of the gods, the All-Father, the ruler of Asgard, and the leader of the Aesir. Odin is a god of many aspects and many names, so many that counting them all is nearly impossible. He is called the All-Father because he is the father of many of the gods, and in some sense the father of all. He is called the Hanged God because he sacrificed himself to himself, hanging from Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights, wounded by his own spear in order to gain the knowledge of the runes, the magical symbols that held power over fate and language and the world itself. He is called the One-Eyed God because he gave up one of his eyes to drink from the well of wisdom. He is associated with war, but not in the way Thor is. Odin is the god of strategy, of cunning, of the leader who inspires warriors and sometimes betrays them when fate demands it. He is a god of poetry and wisdom, of knowledge pursued at any cost. He wanders the worlds in disguise, often as an old man in a cloak and a wide-brimmed hat, carrying a staff, seeking knowledge and testing the hearts of men. He is served by 2 ravens, Hugin and Munin, which mean thought and memory, who fly out each day across all the worlds and return to whisper in his ears everything they have seen and heard. He also has 2 wolves, Jerry and Freki, who sit at his feet in Valhalla and eat the food set before him, for Odin himself consumes nothing but wine. He rides an 8-legged horse named Sleipnir, the fastest of all horses, who can travel between the worlds and even ride through the air. Sleipnir was born of Loki in a strange and uncomfortable tale involving a giant stallion, but that too is a story that will come later. Odin's wife is Frigg, a goddess of motherhood, marriage, love, and domestic order. She is the only goddess who is allowed to sit beside Odin on his high throne and look out over the worlds. Frigg knows the fate of all beings, including the gods, but she never speaks of what she knows. She resides in her own hall, called Fenrir, which means Hall of the Marshes, and she spins clouds from her spinning wheel. Frigg loved her son Baldr more than anything, and when she learned that he was doomed to die, she extracted oaths from every object and creature in the world, making them swear not to harm him. But she overlooked one small thing, and that oversight would lead to tragedy. Thor is perhaps the most beloved of the Norse gods, at least among common people, and certainly the most straightforward. He is the god of thunder, the protector of Midgard and Asgard, the strongest of all the gods, a warrior of immense power and immense appetite. He is the son of Odin and a goddess or giantess named Jord, whose name simply means earth. Thor is huge, red-bearded, quick to anger and quick to laugh, a god who solves problems by hitting them with his hammer. That hammer is called Mjolnir, and it is one of the greatest treasures of the gods, forged by dwarfs and inscribed with runes of power. When Thor throws Mjolnir, it never misses its target, and it always returns to his hand. The sound of thunder is the sound of Thor riding his chariot across the sky, drawn by 2 goats named Tangrisnir and Tangjosta, whose names mean teeth grinder and teeth bearer. These goats could be killed and eaten for food, and then resurrected the next day if their bones were kept intact. Thor wears a belt called Mejingjord that doubles his already immense strength, and he has a pair of iron gloves that allow him to wield Mjolnir properly. He spends much of his time fighting giants, defending the gods and humans from the forces of chaos that threaten the ordered world. His greatest enemy is Jörmungandr, the world's serpent, one of the monstrous children of Loki, and the two are fated to kill each other at Ragnarok. Thor's wife is Sif, a goddess associated with the earth and harvest, who is most famous for her beautiful golden hair. When Loki cut off her hair as a prank, Thor was so enraged that he nearly killed the trickster, and Loki had to commission the dwarfs to make new hair for Sif out of real gold that would grow like natural hair. Thor and Sif have a daughter named Thrud, whose name means strength, and Thor also has two sons, Magni and Modi, whose names mean strength and courage. These sons are among the few gods who will survive Ragnarok and inherit their father's hammer in the new world that comes after. Freyr and Freyja are twin siblings, the children of Njord, the god of the sea, and they are Vanir, members of the other family of gods who came to live in Asgard after the war between the Aesir and Vanir. Freyr is a god of peace, prosperity, fertility, and good weather, associated with sunshine and rain and the growth of crops. He was one of the most widely worshipped gods in Sweden, where kingship and fertility were closely linked. Freyr is described as beautiful and noble, and he owns a ship called Skidbladnir that can be folded up and kept in a pocket when not in use, and a boar named Gullinbursti, whose name means golden bristles, that can run faster than any horse and glows in the dark. Freyr also once owned a sword that could fight on its own, but he gave it away to win the love of a giantess named Gerd, and this loss will cost him his life at Ragnarok. Freyja is the goddess of love, beauty, fertility, war, and death. She is described as the most beautiful of all the goddesses, and she is associated with magic, particularly a form of sorcery called Seda, which involves trance and prophecy and manipulation of fate. Freyja rides a chariot pulled by two cats, and she owns a cloak made of falcon feathers that allows her to fly. She also has a necklace called Brisingamen, the most precious of jewels, which she obtained from 4 dwarfs in exchange for spending a night with each of them, a story that later Christian writers found scandalous, but which may reflect older ideas about fertility and sacred sexuality. Freyja is a goddess of war as well as love. She rides into battle and claims half of the slain warriors, bringing them to her hall Sessrumnir in Folkvanga, while Odin takes the other half to Valhalla. She weeps tears of gold for her missing husband Odda, who has gone travelling and not returned, and she wanders the world searching for him. There is Tyr, an older god whose importance seems to have faded over time, though he was once perhaps the chief god of war before Odin took that role. Tyr is associated with law, justice, and honourable combat. He is best known for sacrificing his hand to bind the wolf Fenrir. When the gods decided to bind Fenrir with a magical chain, the wolf demanded that one of the gods place a hand in his mouth as a pledge of good faith, promising that the binding was harmless. Only Tyr was brave enough to do it, and when Fenrir realized he had been tricked and could not break free, he bit off Tyr's hand. Tyr is sometimes called the one-handed god, and his sacrifice is seen as the price of law and order, a necessary loss to keep the forces of chaos at bay. Heimdall is the watchman of the gods, the guardian of Bifrost, the rainbow bridge. He is said to need less sleep than a bird, and his eyesight and hearing are so acute that he can see for 100 miles in any direction and hear the grass growing on the earth and the wool growing on sheep. He carries a horn called Gijalahorn, and when he blows it at the end of the world, all the 9 realms will hear it, and everyone will know that Ragnarok has begun. Heimdall is sometimes called the whitest of the gods, and he is said to have 9 mothers, all of whom were sisters, though this detail is mysterious and has been interpreted in many ways. He is destined to fight Loki at Ragnarok, and they will kill each other. Baldr is the son of Odin and Frigg, and he is described as the most beautiful, the wisest, the most beloved of all the gods. He is associated with light, purity, and goodness, and everyone who sees him loves him. But Baldr is doomed. He begins to have dreams of his own death, and these dreams trouble the gods greatly. Frigg, desperate to protect her son, travels through all the 9 worlds, and extracts an oath from every object, plant, animal, and element, making them swear not to harm Baldr. Fire and water, iron and stone, trees and beasts, sickness and poison, all swear that they will not hurt him. Only one thing is too small and insignificant for Frigg to bother with: a sprig of mistletoe growing on an oak tree far to the west of Valhalla. Once Baldr is protected, the gods make a game of throwing weapons at him and watching them bounce off harmlessly. But Loki, ever the troublemaker, learns of the mistletoe, and he fashions a dart from it. He gives the dart to Baldr's blind brother Hodder and guides his hand, and when Hodder throws the dart, it pierces Baldr's heart, and he falls dead. The death of Baldr is the beginning of the end, the first crack in the world that will eventually widen into Ragnarok. And then there is Loki, the most complicated figure in all of Norse mythology. Loki is called a god, but he is not truly one of the Aesir or the Vanir. He is the son of 2 giants, Farborti and Laufey, but he lives among the gods in Asgard and is counted as Odin's blood brother, bound to him by oaths made long ago. Loki is a trickster, a shapeshifter, a liar, and a schemer. He causes problems for the gods, and then he solves them, often in ways that create new problems. He is handsome and charming and malicious, and he seems to delight in chaos for its own sake. Loki is the father of monsters, by a giantess named Angerboda, whose name means bringer of sorrow. He has 3 children: Fenrir the wolf, Jörmungandr the world serpent, and Hel, the goddess of the dead. These 3 are prophesied to play central roles in the destruction of the gods at Ragnarok. When the gods learned of these children, they feared them and their power, and Odin commanded that they be brought to Asgard. Jörmungandr, the serpent, was still small at that time, and Odin picked him up and hurled him into the ocean that surrounds Midgard. But the serpent grew and grew, fed by the sea, until he became so vast that he encircled the entire world, biting his own tail, a loop of scales and venom lying in the depths. He became known as the Midgard serpent, and he waits there still, coiled around the world, and it is said that if he ever lets go of his tail, the end times will begin. Hel, the daughter, was cast down by Odin into the dark realm of Niflheim, and there she was given dominion over the dead, ruling over those who did not die in glory. And Fenrir, the wolf, was kept in Asgard for a time, for the gods hoped to control him. Only Tyr was brave enough to feed the growing wolf, approaching him each day with meat, while the other gods kept their distance. But Fenrir grew larger and stronger with each passing day, and the gods saw their mistake. The wolf's strength was immense, and the prophecy said that he would one day devour Odin himself. So the gods decided that Fenrir must be bound. They forged a great chain called Leading and brought it to the wolf, challenging him to test his strength by seeing if he could break it. Fenrir allowed them to bind him, and then with one great flex of his muscles, he shattered the chain. The gods laughed nervously and praised his strength, pretending it had all been a game. They forged a second chain, even stronger, called Dromi, and again they challenged Fenrir. Again he broke free, this time with more effort, but free nonetheless. Now the gods were truly afraid. They sent a messenger to the dwarfs, the master craftsmen who lived beneath the earth, and they commissioned a binding that could not be broken. The dwarfs worked their magic and their craft, and they created a ribbon called Gleipnir. It was soft and smooth and thin as silk, and it was made from 6 impossible things: the sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird. These things do not exist, or they exist in such a way that they cannot be gathered, and that is why Gleipnir could not be broken, for it was made from the absence of things, from the gaps in the world. The gods brought Gleipnir to Fenrir and challenged him again, showing him the thin ribbon and asking if he dared to be bound by something so delicate. But Fenrir was not fooled. He saw the gods' nervousness, and he sensed the magic in the ribbon. He said he would allow himself to be bound, but only if one of the gods would place a hand in his mouth as a pledge of good faith, a guarantee that if he could not break free, they would release him. The gods looked at one another, and no one moved. They knew they had no intention of releasing the wolf, and they knew that whoever placed their hand in Fenrir's mouth would lose it. Finally, Tyr stepped forward. He had fed the wolf. He had shown him kindness, and now he placed his right hand between Fenrir's jaws. The gods wound Gleipnir around Fenrir's body, and the wolf strained to break it. He pulled and twisted and thrashed, but the ribbon only grew tighter. The more he struggled, the stronger it became. Fenrir realized he had been tricked, betrayed by those he had trusted, and in his rage he bit down, severing Tyr's hand at the wrist. The gods laughed at Fenrir's capture, all except Tyr, who stood silent, cradling his bleeding stump. The gods took the wolf far away to a lonely island, and they bound him to a great boulder sunk deep into the earth, and they thrust a sword into his mouth to hold his jaws open so he could not bite. Foam pours from Fenrir's mouth, and it flows as a river called Von, the river of hope or expectation, for the wolf waits in his bonds, biding his time, and one day, when Ragnarok comes, he will break free and take his revenge. Loki also has a wife among the gods, a goddess named Sigyn, and with her he has 2 sons, Nafi and Vali. Their fate is bound up with Loki's own punishment, which comes later, after the death of Baldr, when Loki's tricks finally go too far, and the gods decide he must be made to pay. The death of Baldr is the turning point in the mythology, the moment when the age of the gods begins its slow collapse. Baldr, the beautiful, the beloved, the son of Odin and Frigg, began to have nightmares, dreams of his own death that filled him with dread. He told his mother, and Frigg was overcome with fear. She could not bear the thought of losing him, and so she set out to protect him in the only way she knew. She traveled through all the 9 worlds, visiting every creature, every object, every element, and from each of them she extracted an oath that they would not harm Baldr. Fire swore it would not burn him. Water swore it would not drown him. Iron and steel and stone swore they would not cut or crush him. Diseases and poisons swore they would leave him untouched. Animals and plants and trees all gave their oaths. Frigg was thorough and determined, driven by a mother's desperate love. But there was one thing she overlooked. Far to the west of Valhalla, growing on the side of an oak tree, was a sprig of mistletoe. It was small and young, hardly more than a weed, and Frigg thought it too insignificant to bother with. She did not ask it for an oath. When Frigg returned to Asgard and announced that Baldr was now invulnerable, the gods were delighted, and they invented a new game. They would take turns throwing weapons at Baldr, stones and axes and spears, and everything would bounce off him harmlessly. Baldr stood in the center of the field, smiling and unafraid, and the gods laughed and cheered as each object failed to harm him. It was a celebration, a proof of the power of oaths and the love of a mother. But Loki watched, and he did not laugh. He felt jealousy and resentment, or perhaps he simply felt the pull of chaos, the need to disrupt the order of things. He disguised himself as an old woman and went to Frigg's hall, and he struck up a conversation with her, asking about Baldr and his strange invulnerability. Frigg, proud of her work, explained what she had done, how she had traveled the worlds and secured oaths from all things. The old woman asked if truly everything had sworn the oath, and Frigg admitted that she had overlooked one small plant, a mistletoe growing to the west, far too young and weak to be a threat. Loki left immediately, casting off his disguise, and he went to find the mistletoe. He cut it from the tree and shaped it into a dart, sharpening its point, and then he returned to the gathering of the gods. The game was still going on, and everyone was still throwing things at Baldr and celebrating his immunity. Loki noticed that Hodder, Baldr's brother, was standing apart from the others, not participating. Hodder was blind, unable to see where Baldr stood, and he felt left out of the celebration. Loki approached him kindly, offering to help. He placed the mistletoe dart in Hodder's hand and guided his arm, pointing him in the right direction. Hodder threw the dart. It flew straight and true, and it pierced Baldr's heart. The beautiful god fell dead without a sound, and the laughter stopped. The field was silent. The gods stood frozen, unable to believe what they had seen. Baldr lay still on the ground, his golden hair spilled in the grass, his light gone from the world. Frigg screamed, and Odin's face turned dark with grief and rage. Hodder stood confused, not understanding what he had done, the mistletoe still in his hand. The gods carried Baldr's body to the sea, and they placed him on his ship, Hringhorni, the greatest of all ships. They piled the ship with treasure and grave goods, and they laid Baldr's wife Nanna beside him, for she had died of grief when she saw her husband fall. Thor came and consecrated the funeral pyre with his hammer, and the gods prepared to push the ship out to sea and set it aflame. But the ship was so heavy that no one could move it, and so they called for a giantess named Hyrrokin, who came riding on a wolf with a serpent for reins. She pushed the ship with such force that the earth shook and flames burst from the rollers beneath it, and the ship slid into the water. Then they lit the pyre, and it blazed up, consuming Baldr and Nanna and all the treasures of the gods, and the ship drifted out into the sea, burning, until it sank beneath the waves. Frigg could not accept her son's death. She begged for someone to travel to Hel, the realm of the dead, and offer a ransom to bring Baldr back. One of Odin's sons, Hermod, volunteered. He rode Sleipnir, Odin's 8-legged horse, down the dark road to Niflheim, across the bridge of the dead, into the cold halls where the goddess Hel ruled. He found Baldr there, sitting in a place of honor, and he begged Hel to release him. Hel agreed, but she set a condition. If every living thing in all the worlds would weep for Baldr, he could return, but if even one being refused to weep, he would remain in her realm forever. Hermod rode back and told the gods, and messengers were sent throughout the 9 worlds, asking all creatures to weep for Baldr. And they did. Humans wept, and animals wept. The trees wept sap, and the stones wept dew. Even the metals wept, sweating moisture in the forges. Everything mourned the lost god, and it seemed that Baldr would return. But in a cave far from Asgard, the messengers found a giantess named Thok, old and bitter, sitting alone. They asked her to weep for Baldr, and she refused. She said she had no love for Baldr, that she had gained nothing from him in life, and would gain nothing from him in death, and that Hel could keep what she had. The messengers returned with heavy hearts, and Baldr remained in the land of the dead. Many believe that Thok was Loki in disguise, one final act of malice to ensure that Baldr would not return. Whether this is true or not, Loki is blamed for all of it, for the death and for the failure of the ransom, and the gods' patience with him finally runs out. The gods hunted Loki, and he fled from them, hiding in the mountains, shape-shifting into a salmon and swimming in a waterfall. But the gods found him and caught him in a net, and they dragged him to a cave deep underground. They took his son Nafi and transformed his other son Vali into a wolf, and Vali tore out his brother's throat. The gods took Nafi's entrails and used them to bind Loki to 3 great rocks, one under his shoulders, one under his loins, and one under his legs. Then Skadi, a giantess who had her own grudge against Loki, placed a venomous serpent above his head, and its poison dripped onto his face. Loki's wife Sigyn remained with him, holding a bowl to catch the venom and spare him the worst of the pain. But when the bowl fills, she must turn away to empty it, and in those moments the poison drips onto Loki's face, and he writhes in agony, and his thrashing shakes the earth, causing what humans call earthquakes. There Loki lies, bound and tormented until Ragnarok, when his bonds will break, and he will rise to take his revenge on the gods who punished him. With Baldr dead and Loki bound, the golden age of the gods comes to an end. The world grows colder and darker, and the gods know that their time is running out. But before we reach the end, before we walk through Ragnarok, we must step back and understand how these gods and their world functioned, what they meant to the people who believed in them, and how the mythology was lived, not just told. Norse mythology was not a religion in the way we often think of religion today, with a holy book and a formal theology and an organized priesthood. It was a living tradition, a set of stories and rituals and beliefs that shaped how people understood the world and their place in it. The Norse people of the Viking Age roughly from the late 8th century through the 11th century, lived in a world that was harsh and unpredictable, where survival depended on strength, cunning, and the favor of forces greater than themselves. The gods they worshipped were not distant and perfect. They were powerful but flawed, capable of great deeds, but also prone to mistakes, passions, and dooms they could not escape. This made them relatable, understandable, gods you could bargain with, gods who understood struggle and loss because they experienced it themselves. Worship in Norse society seems to have been decentralized and personal. There were no grand temples in the Christian sense, though there were sacred sites, groves, and perhaps buildings where rituals were performed. Sacrifices were common, offerings of animals and occasionally other things given to the gods to secure their favor, to ensure good harvests, victory in battle, or safe journeys across the sea. Festivals marked the turning of the seasons, times when the community gathered to feast and honor the gods and the spirits of the land. Chieftains and local leaders often acted as priests, performing the rites and speaking the words that bound the community to the divine. Different gods were honored for different purposes. Thor was especially popular among common people, farmers and sailors who prayed to him for protection from giants and storms, for the thunder and rain that made crops grow, for strength in daily life. Odin was the god of kings and warriors, of poets and those who sought hidden knowledge, but he was also feared, for he was fickle and his favor could turn without warning. Freyr and Freyja were invoked for fertility, for love and marriage, for prosperity and abundance. Tyr was called upon for justice and courage in battle. Each god had a sphere, a domain where their power was strongest, and people would make offerings and prayers to the god most appropriate to their need. The afterlife in Norse belief was more complicated than a simple heaven or hell. Warriors who died in battle could be chosen by Odin or Freyja and brought to Valhalla or Folkvanga, where they would feast and fight and prepare for Ragnarok. This was considered an honor, a glorious fate for those who lived by the sword. But not everyone sought that fate. Most people died of age or sickness or accident, and they went to hell, the realm of the dead ruled by the goddess of the same name. Hell was not necessarily a place of punishment, though it was cold and dim and far from the living world. It was simply where the dead went, and they lived there a kind of shadowy existence, removed from the warmth and light of life. There were also other possible destinations. Those who drowned at sea might be claimed by the goddess Ran, who pulled them down into her halls beneath the waves. The myths are not always consistent on these points, and it is likely that beliefs varied from region to region, from one community to another. Fate, or weird, was a central concept in Norse thought. The Norns wove the fates of all beings, and not even the gods could escape what was ordained. This created a worldview that was simultaneously fatalistic and heroic. If your fate was set, then there was no point in trying to avoid it, but there was great honor in facing it with courage, in choosing how you met your doom, even if you could not choose the doom itself. The hero was not the one who won, but the one who fought well, who remained true to their oaths and their identity, even in the face of certain defeat. This is perhaps the defining characteristic of Norse mythology, the refusal to despair even when hope is gone, the determination to stand and fight at the end of the world, even though the gods know they will lose. The myths themselves served many functions. They explained the origins of the world and the nature of the cosmos. They provided examples of behavior, both good and bad, showing the consequences of pride, treachery, courage, and wisdom. They entertained, for these were good stories, full of drama and conflict and strange wonders. They bound the community together, giving people a shared language, a common set of symbols and references that defined who they were and how they understood existence. And they offered comfort, or at least clarity, about the hard truths of life, that everything ends, that even the gods are not eternal, that death comes for everyone, but that how you live and how you face that death is what matters. As Christianity spread through Scandinavia in the 10th and 11th centuries, The old gods were gradually abandoned, at least officially. Kings converted, often for political reasons, and they brought their people with them, sometimes willingly and sometimes by force. The old temples were torn down or converted into churches. The old festivals were reinterpreted as Christian holy days. The myths stopped being belief and became stories, folklore, curiosities. But they did not disappear entirely. They were written down, preserved by Christian scholars like Snorri Sturluson, who valued them as cultural heritage, as the foundation of poetry, as something worth remembering even if it was no longer worshipped. And so the myths survived, passed down through the centuries, rediscovered by modern readers who find in them something powerful and strange, a window into a world that saw things differently, a mythology that embraced darkness and endings without flinching. Now we come to the great cycles of stories, the tales that were told and retold, that entertained and instructed, that revealed the character of the gods and the nature of their world. These stories are not always easy to organize, for they do not follow a single chronological narrative, and they were likely told in different orders and combinations depending on the teller and the audience. But certain themes and episodes stand out, moments that capture the essence of the mythology, and we can walk through them slowly, carefully, seeing what they reveal. There is the story of the Aesir-Vanir War, the first war in the history of the world, a conflict between two families of gods that ended not in victory, but in peace and integration. The cause of the war is not entirely clear in the surviving sources. One account says that the Aesir mistreated a Vanir goddess named Gulveig, stabbing her with spears and burning her 3 times, though she was reborn each time. Another interpretation suggests that Gulveig may have been Freyja herself, sent as a representative of the Vanir and insulted or harmed by the Aesir. Regardless of the exact cause, the Vanir were enraged, and they armed themselves for battle. The war that followed was long and terrible, and neither side could claim a clear victory. The Aesir were gods of power and strategy, but the Vanir commanded the forces of nature, the fertility of the earth, the wealth of the sea. The two sides fought to exhaustion, and finally they agreed to make peace. To seal the peace and ensure that it would last, they exchanged hostages. The Vanir sent Njord, the god of the sea and wealth, and his 2 children, Freyr and Freyja, to live among the Aesir in Asgard. The Aesir sent Honir, a god associated with silence and spirituality, and Mimir, a being of immense wisdom, to live among the Vanir. The arrangement worked well for the Aesir. Freyr and Freyja and Njord were welcomed into Asgard, and they became integral members of the pantheon, honored and loved by the other gods. But the Vanir were less satisfied with their hostages. Honir was tall and handsome and seemed well suited to leadership, but whenever he was asked to make a decision, he would turn to Mimir for advice, saying, "Let others decide," if Mimir was not present. The Vanir realized that they had been cheated, that Honir was useless without Mimir, and in their anger they cut off Mimir's head and sent it back to Odin. Odin received the head and did not despair. He preserved it with herbs and magic, and he spoke charms over it, and Mimir's head continued to speak, offering counsel and wisdom to Odin for the rest of his days. Despite this grim episode, the peace between the Aesir and Vanir held, and the two groups of gods remained united, a single pantheon, until the end. There is the story of Thor's journey to the land of the giants, where he is humiliated and tested, and where he learns that even his great strength has limits. One of the most famous versions of this tale involves Thor traveling to Jotunheim with Loki and 2 servants, Thjalfi and Roskva. They come to the hall of a giant king named Utgarda-Loki, a name that means Loki of the outer world, though he is not the same as the trickster god. Utgarda-Loki mocks Thor and his companions, calling them small and weak, and he challenges them to prove themselves in contests. Loki enters an eating contest and loses. Thjalfi enters a foot race and loses. Thor is challenged to drink from a horn, and he drinks deeply, 3 great draughts, but the level in the horn barely drops. He is challenged to lift a cat, but he can only raise one of its paws off the ground. Finally, he is challenged to wrestle an old woman, and she brings him to his knees. Humiliated, Thor prepares to leave, but Loki stops him and reveals the truth. Everything in the hall had been an illusion, a trick to humble the god of thunder. The one Loki had competed against in eating was wildfire itself, which consumes everything. The one Jalfi had raced against was thought, which moves faster than any runner. The horn Thor drank from was connected to the sea, and he had drunk so much that he lowered the ocean level and created the tides. The cat he had tried to lift was Jörmungandr, the world's serpent, in disguise, and Thor had lifted it so high that its back touched the sky. The old woman he wrestled was old age, which defeats everyone in the end. Loki explains that he had feared Thor's strength so much that he had to use magic to protect himself and his hall. And then, before Thor can respond with violence, the giant and his hall vanish, leaving the god alone and angry and perhaps a little wiser. This story reveals the nature of Thor's strength, immense but not infinite, and it shows that even gods can be deceived. There is the story of how Thor's hammer was stolen. One morning, Thor awoke to find that Mjolnir was gone. He raged and searched, but the hammer was nowhere in Asgard. Loki offered to help, and he borrowed Freyja's falcon cloak and flew to Jotunheim to investigate. There he found a giant named Thrym sitting on a hill, braiding golden collars for his dogs. Loki asked if Thrym knew anything about the missing hammer, and the giant laughed and admitted that he had stolen it. He had buried it 8 miles beneath the earth, and he would not return it unless the gods gave him Freyja as his bride. Loki flew back to Asgard and reported the giant's demand. The gods gathered to discuss what to do, and they turned to Freyja and told her to put on a bridal veil and prepare to marry Thrym. Freyja exploded in anger. Her necklace, the Brisingamen, burst from her throat and flew across the hall. She refused, absolutely and furiously, to marry a giant for any reason. The gods fell silent, uncertain how to proceed. Then Heimdall, the watchman, suggested a plan. Thor himself would disguise himself as Freyja, wearing a bridal dress and a veil, and Loki would accompany him disguised as a bridesmaid. Together, they would go to Jotunheim, retrieve the hammer, and then take their revenge. Thor hated the idea. He said the other gods would mock him forever if he dressed as a woman. But Loki pointed out that without Mjolnir, the giants would soon overrun Asgard, and Thor would be mocked for far worse than wearing a dress. Reluctantly, Thor agreed. He was dressed in bridal clothes, a veil was placed over his head, and the Brisingamen was hung around his neck. Loki took the form of a handmaid, and the two of them rode to Jotunheim in a chariot pulled by Thor's goats. Thrym was delighted when they arrived. He held a great feast to celebrate his wedding, and Thor, pretending to be Freyja, sat beside him at the table. The giant was astonished at his bride's appetite. Thor ate an entire ox, ate salmon, and all the delicacies meant for the women, and he drank 3 casks of mead. Thrym asked why Freyja was eating so much, and Loki quickly explained that she had been so excited about the wedding that she had not eaten for 8 days. Thrym tried to kiss his bride, but he lifted the veil and saw Thor's burning eyes staring back at him, and he recoiled in shock. Loki explained that Freyja had not slept for 8 nights, so eager was she to come to Jotunheim, and that was why her eyes looked so fierce. Finally, Thrym called for the wedding gift to be brought forth, the hammer Mjolnir, which would be laid in the bride's lap to bless the marriage. The hammer was carried into the hall and placed before Thor. The god's fingers closed around the handle, and he laughed, a sound like thunder. He threw off his veil and stood, and he swung Mjolnir, and he killed Thrym, and then he killed all the other giants in the hall. Thor and Loki rode back to Asgard, victorious, and though the other gods did tease Thor about his disguise, they were grateful to have Mjolnir back, for without it, they would have been defenseless. These stories, and many others like them, show the gods not as perfect beings, but as people, shaped by pride and fear and desire, capable of cleverness and foolishness in equal measure. They are stories of problem-solving, of dealing with threats through strength or cunning or both. They are entertaining, but they also serve a function, illustrating values and showing how even gods must adapt and struggle to survive in a dangerous world. And then there are the darker stories, the ones that point toward the ending. The death of Baldr is the most famous of these, but there are others. There is the story of the building of Asgard's wall, where a stranger comes to the gods and offers to build them an impregnable fortification in exchange for the sun, the moon, and the goddess Freyja. The gods agree, thinking the task impossible, but the stranger has a powerful horse named Svadilfari, and the work proceeds faster than anyone expected. As the deadline approaches, the gods realize that the stranger will actually succeed, and they panic. They force Loki to find a solution, and Loki transforms himself into a mare and lures Svadilfari away, distracting the horse so that the wall is not finished in time. The stranger flies into a rage and reveals himself as a giant, and Thor kills him with one blow of Mjolnir. And months later, Loki gives birth to an 8-legged foal, Sleipnir, who becomes Odin's mount. The story is strange and unsettling, full of deception and desperation, showing how close the gods came to losing everything. And it introduces Sleipnir, the horse who will carry Odin into the final battle. There is the story of Odin's self-sacrifice on Yggdrasil, where he hangs himself from the world tree, wounded by his own spear, for 9 days and nights without food or water, staring down into the depths until the runes reveal themselves to him. This is not a story of resurrection or salvation. It is a story of suffering for knowledge, of paying a terrible price to gain power over fate and language. Odin speaks of it himself in the poem known as the Havamal, part of the Poetic Edda, describing how he hung on the windy tree, how he received no bread or drink, how he looked down and took up the runes with a cry, and then he fell. The runes became his, symbols of magic and meaning, and with them he could shape the world, but the cost was high, and the knowledge he gained included the knowledge of his own death. There is the story of the goddess Idun, who keeps the apples of youth that the gods eat to remain young and strong. Loki is tricked into betraying her, luring her out of Asgard so that a giant named Thyrsi can kidnap her and take the apples. Without the apples, the gods begin to age rapidly, their hair turning grey, their strength failing. They force Loki to rescue Idun, and he does, transforming into a falcon and flying to Jotunheim, turning Idun into a nut and carrying her back in his claws. Thyrsi pursues them in the form of an eagle, and when they reach Asgard, the gods light a great fire, and the eagle flies into it and burns, and Thyrsi dies. But his daughter Skadi comes to Asgard seeking revenge, and the gods must make peace with her, offering her a husband and making her laugh. And Loki, ever the clown and the villain, provides the laughter through a crude and painful stunt involving a goat and a rope tied to his own body. Skadi becomes part of the community of gods, but she never forgives Loki, and she is the one who places the serpent above his head when he is finally bound. All of these stories are threads in a larger pattern, and that pattern is leading toward one inevitable destination. The gods are not building toward a triumph. They are walking toward an ending, a final confrontation with the forces they have fought and tried to contain throughout the ages. Everything they have done, every victory and every compromise, has been a delaying action, a way to hold off the inevitable. But the inevitable cannot be held off forever. And so we come to Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, the end of the world, the twilight of the powers. Ragnarok is not a sudden event. It begins with signs, with a slow unraveling of the order that the gods have maintained. The first sign is a terrible winter, called Fimbulwinter, the Great Winter, which lasts for 3 years without any summer between. Snow falls from all directions. Frosts are harsh and biting. Winds howl and give no peace. The sun provides no warmth. In this long freeze, the world of men falls into chaos. Brothers fight brothers. Fathers and sons turn on one another. Greed and violence spread as people struggle to survive, and the bonds of kinship and honor break down. This is called the Age of Axes, the Age of Swords, the Age of Wolves, when no one spares anyone else. In the sky, strange things happen. The wolves that have chased the sun and moon since the beginning of time finally catch their prey. The wolf skull swallows the sun, and the wolf hattie devours the moon, and darkness falls over the world. The stars disappear. The earth shakes with great earthquakes, and mountains crumble, and every bond and fetter is broken. Fenrir, the great wolf who has been bound on the island since the gods tricked him, breaks his chains at last. The earth trembles as he rises, and his jaws stretch wide, so wide that his lower jaw touches the ground and his upper jaw scrapes the sky, and flames pour from his eyes and nostrils. He howls, and the sound echoes through all the worlds, a signal that the time has come. Loki, too, breaks free from his bonds beneath the earth. The earthquake that shakes the world snaps the chains made from his son's entrails, and he rises, free at last after ages of torment. He is filled with hatred for the gods who bound him, and he calls his children and his allies to him. Ginnungagap, the world serpent, thrashes in the ocean, and the seas rise up and flood the land. The serpent drags itself onto the shore, venom dripping from its fangs, its body so vast that it stretches across mountains and valleys, leaving a trail of poison in its wake. The ocean churns and boils, and great waves crash over Midgard, drowning fields and forests. From the realm of the dead, a ship comes forth, a vessel called Naglfar, built from the fingernails and toenails of the dead. The ship is captained by Atrim, a giant, and it carries the legions of hell, the dishonored dead, those who died in sickness or old age or accident, corpses walking and marching toward war. Loki stands at the helm, guiding them toward Asgard. From the south, from the burning realm of Muspelheim, comes another army, the fire giants led by Surtur, the ancient one who has waited since the beginning of time. Surtur carries a sword that blazes brighter than the sun, and as he and his host march northward, the earth burns behind them. They cross the rainbow bridge Bifrost, and the bridge, which has stood since the creation of the world, shatters and falls under the weight of their army. Heimdall, the watchman of the gods, sees them coming. He lifts the Gjala horn to his lips and blows, and the sound of the horn rings out through all the 9 worlds, so loud that everyone, god and giant and human and elf, knows that the final battle has begun. In Asgard, the gods arm themselves. They know what the prophecies have said. They know that they will lose, but they go to battle anyway, because that is what they do, what they have always done, what they were made to do. Odin consults the head of Mimir one last time, seeking counsel, seeking wisdom, and then he rides forth on Sleipnir, his spear Gungnir in his hand, leading the Aesir to war. From Valhalla come the Einherjar, the warriors who have feasted and fought in Odin's hall since their deaths, 800 warriors pouring out through each of Valhalla's 540 doors, a vast army of the honored dead, ready at last for the battle they have been preparing for. The gods and the dead march to a place called Vigrid, a great plain that stretches 100 leagues in every direction, and there they meet their enemies. The battle is chaos. Odin rides straight toward Fenrir, the wolf who has been prophesied to kill him. The Allfather fights with fury and skill, but Fenrir is too strong, too ancient, too filled with rage. The wolf's jaws close around Odin, and he swallows the god whole, and the Allfather, the ruler of Asgard, the seeker of wisdom, the wanderer, is dead. But Odin's son Vidar, the silent god, steps forward immediately. He wears a shoe made from all the leather scraps that have been discarded since the beginning of time, a shoe that is impossibly strong, and he places that shoe on Fenrir's lower jaw and grips the upper jaw with his hands, and he tears the wolf's mouth apart, killing the beast that killed his father. Thor faces Jörmungandr, the enemy he has fought before, the serpent he lifted in Utgarda-Loki's hall without knowing what it was. The god of thunder and the world serpent meet in the center of the battlefield, and they clash with terrible violence. Thor strikes the serpent with Mjolnir again and again, and finally he lands a blow that crushes the serpent's skull, killing it. But the serpent's venom sprays over Thor, soaking him, burning him, and the god stumbles backward. He takes 9 steps, and then he falls dead, poisoned by the creature he has just killed. Freyr fights Surtur, the fire giant, and the battle is brief and brutal. Freyr is brave and strong, but he lacks his sword, the blade that could fight on its own, the sword he gave away to win the love of a giantess. Without it, he cannot match Surtur's flaming weapon, and the fire giant cuts him down. Tyr faces Garm, the hound of hell, a monstrous dog that has broken free from its chains in the underworld. The one-handed god and the beast fight savagely, and they kill each other, falling together in the blood and mud of Vigrid. Heimdall and Loki, old enemies, meet at last. They have been set on a collision course since the beginning, the Guardian and the Trickster, order and chaos, and now they fight with all the hatred and history that lies between them. They struggle and strike and grapple, and in the end they slay one another, their bodies collapsing side by side. The battlefield is a slaughter. Gods fall, giants fall. The Einherjar are cut down, the sky splits and burns. Surtur, victorious over Freyr, raises his flaming sword and sets the world ablaze. The fires spread across Midgard and Asgard and all the realms, consuming forests and fields, halls and mountains. The heat is so intense that the stars themselves are scorched and fall from the sky. Yggdrasil, the world tree, shudders and groans, its branches burning, its roots withering. But even now, at the end of everything, the tree does not fall. The earth itself can no longer bear the destruction. It cracks and breaks apart, and the land sinks beneath the sea. The ocean rises and covers everything, the waves closing over the ruins of the world, drowning the flames, swallowing Asgard and Midgard and Jotunheim and all the realms. Darkness and silence descend. The age of the gods is over. But that is not the end. The Norse did not believe that destruction was final, that death was the last word. After the fire and the flood, after the darkness and the silence, something new begins. The earth rises again from the sea, green and fertile, washed clean by the waters. The sun has been devoured, but the sun had a daughter, born before the wolf caught her mother, and this new sun rises into the sky, shining warmly on the newborn world. Grass grows. Trees take root. Animals return. The world is beautiful again, untouched by the scars of the old battles, a paradise unmarred by the violence and strife that marked the age of gods and giants. Some of the gods survive. Vidar, who killed Fenrir, and Vali, Odin's son, live through the destruction. Modi and Magni, Thor's sons, find their father's hammer Mjolnir lying in the grass, and they take it up, inheriting his strength. Honir, the silent god who was sent to the Vanir as a hostage so long ago, returns and walks the fields of the new earth. And from the wreckage of Asgard, two gods emerge who were thought lost. Baldr and his brother Hodder, released from hell, returned from the realm of the dead, reconciled at last. These surviving gods gather in the place where Asgard once stood, and they sit in the grass and talk, remembering the old world, speaking of the past and the great deeds and the terrible mistakes, finding Odin's golden chess pieces in the ruins and marveling at them. They do not rebuild Asgard as it was. They do not need to. The age of strife is over. And humanity survives as well. During the destruction, when Surtur's flames consumed the world, two humans hid themselves in a place called Hodmir's forest, or in some versions, in the branches of Yggdrasil itself. Their names are Lif and Lifthrasil, which mean life and eager for life. They hid there through all the fire and flood, protected by the tree, nourished by morning dew. When the new earth rises from the sea, Lif and Lifthrasil emerge, blinking in the sunlight, and they look out over the green world spread before them. They are alone, the last of the old humanity, the first of the new, and from them will come all the people of the reborn world. They will have children, and those children will have children, and the earth will be filled with life once more, a new humanity living in a world without the constant threat of war and doom. Some sources hint that a new hall rises, greater and more beautiful than any that came before, a place where the righteous will dwell, though the details are sparse and debated. There are hints of a mighty god coming, though who or what this god might be is unclear, and some scholars believe this is a later addition, influenced by Christian ideas of a savior or a final judgment. What is clear is that the cycle continues. The world ends and begins again. The old gives way to the new. Death is followed by rebirth. This is the pattern woven into the heart of Norse mythology, the understanding that nothing lasts forever, that even the gods must pass away, but that life finds a way to continue, that the tree endures, that the sun rises again. Ragnarok is not a story about despair. It is a story about facing the inevitable with courage. The gods know what is coming. They know they will lose, but they go to battle anyway, because to do otherwise would be to surrender their identity, their purpose, their honor. They fight not because they believe they can win, but because fighting is what they are, and to refuse would be a deeper death than any sword could inflict. This is the heart of the Norse worldview, the idea that how you face fate matters more than the fate itself, that dignity and bravery in the face of doom are the highest virtues. And the fact that the world is reborn, that life continues, that something new and perhaps better emerges from the ashes, offers a kind of hope, not hope for escape or salvation, but hope that the struggle means something, that the pattern continues, that the ending is also a beginning. The myths were preserved through centuries of change, passed from pagan believers to Christian scribes, from oral tradition to written manuscripts, from medieval Iceland to modern readers around the world. Iceland played a central role in this preservation. When Christianity came to Iceland in the year 1000, adopted by a vote at the Althing, the National Assembly, the old gods were officially abandoned. But Iceland was remote, isolated by the North Atlantic, and the traditions there were strong. The stories were remembered, valued as cultural heritage, even after they ceased to be religious truth. In the 12th and 13th centuries, Icelandic scholars began to write them down, recognizing that if they did not act, the myths would be lost entirely. Snorri Sturluson, born in 1179, was one of the most important of these scholars. He was a chieftain, a poet, a politician, a man deeply involved in the turbulent politics of medieval Iceland, and he met a violent end, murdered in his home in 1241 during a power struggle. But before his death, he wrote the Prose Edda, a work that combines mythological narrative with a treatise on poetic composition. Snorri was a Christian, but he valued the old stories, partly for their literary beauty, partly because they were essential to understanding the complex metaphors and allusions that filled traditional Norse poetry, and partly, perhaps, because they were his heritage, the stories of his ancestors, and he did not want them forgotten. His Edda begins with a prologue that attempts to rationalize the myths, suggesting that the gods were actually ancient kings and heroes who were later worshipped, a common medieval Christian strategy for dealing with pagan gods. But once that disclaimer is out of the way, Snorri tells the myths in vivid detail, drawing on older poems and his own knowledge, creating the most comprehensive single account of Norse mythology that survives. The Poetic Edda, the other major source, is a collection of poems copied into a manuscript in Iceland around 1270, though the poems themselves are older. The manuscript was discovered in an Icelandic farmhouse in 1643 by a bishop named Brynjolfur Sveinsson, who recognized its importance and sent it to the King of Denmark. The poems are anonymous, composed in the traditional alliterative meter of Old Norse verse, and they cover a wide range of subjects: the creation of the world, the deeds of gods and heroes, wisdom sayings, prophecies, and elegies. Some of the most important mythological poems are the Voluspa, which tells the history of the world from creation through Ragnarok and the rebirth, and the Havamal, which contains wisdom attributed to Odin, including the story of his self-sacrifice on Yggdrasil. These poems are difficult, elusive, often cryptic, assuming knowledge that the original audience would have had, but that modern readers must reconstruct. But they preserve voices from the pagan past, fragments of belief and story that would otherwise be lost. Other sources add pieces to the puzzle. The sagas, prose narratives written in Iceland in the 13th and 14th centuries occasionally reference the old gods and include mythological motifs, though they are primarily concerned with human history and family feuds. Saxo Grammaticus, a Danish historian writing around 1200, included versions of Norse myths in his Gesta Danorum, the history of the Danes, though his accounts are often heavily Christianized and interpreted through a Latin lens. Runestones scattered across Scandinavia bear inscriptions that reference gods and myths, brief glimpses into how people invoke the divine in everyday life. Archaeological evidence, temples and shrines and burial sites, offers physical proof of religious practice. Though the gods worshipped there remain silent, their prayers and rituals lost to time. What emerges from all these sources is a mythology that is incomplete, fragmentary, sometimes contradictory, but also powerful and distinctive. The Norse myths are not neat or systematic. They do not offer easy moral lessons or comforting reassurances about the afterlife. They are stories about flawed gods in a doomed world, fighting battles they cannot win, making mistakes, loving and hating and sacrificing, all under the shadow of an ending they cannot escape. They reflect a culture that valued courage, honor, wisdom, and generosity, but also recognized the harsh realities of life in a difficult world where survival was uncertain and death was always close. They reflect a worldview that saw the universe as a balance of opposing forces, order and chaos, fire and ice, gods and giants, locked in eternal struggle, neither side fully good or fully evil, both necessary for the world to exist. The myths influenced the people who believed them in practical ways. Warriors invoked Odin and Thor before battle, seeking strength and victory. Farmers prayed to Freyr for good harvests and to Thor for rain. Women called on Freyja for love and fertility. Kings claimed descent from Odin to legitimize their rule, tracing their lineage back to the gods themselves. Poetry was seen as a sacred art, a gift from Odin, who had stolen the mead of poetry from the giants in a daring and complicated theft that involved shape-shifting, seduction, and betrayal. To be a poet was to participate in something divine, to use words in ways that shaped reality, that preserved memory and honor, that made the dead immortal through verse. The myths also shaped how people understood fate and death. The concept of weird, fate, was central to Norse thought. Fate was not something imposed by the gods. The gods themselves were subject to it, woven into the pattern by the Norns, the three women who lived by the well of fate and spun the threads of every life. This created a worldview that was neither optimistic nor pessimistic, but realistic and stoic. If your fate was set, there was no point in trying to avoid it, but there was great value in how you faced it, in maintaining your honor and courage and identity even when all was lost. The hero was not the one who escaped death, for no one escapes death, but the one who met death well, who remained true to themselves and their people until the end. This is why the gods march to Ragnarok even though they know they will fall. They could flee, hide, surrender, but that would be worse than death. They are gods and gods fight, and so they go to Vigrid, and they die as gods should die, weapons in hand, defiant to the last. This ethos permeated Viking Age society, influencing everything from warfare to law to personal relationships. Oaths were sacred, binding not just in a legal sense, but in a cosmic sense, and to break an oath was to damage the very fabric of reality, to align yourself with chaos and the forces of destruction. Hospitality was a sacred duty, for Odin himself wandered the world in disguise, testing the generosity of mortals, and to turn away a stranger might be to offend the All-Father. Courage in battle was prized above almost all else, for a glorious death could earn you a place in Valhalla, where you would feast and fight until Ragnarok. But even those who did not seek Valhalla, who lived quiet lives and died in their beds, were part of the pattern, woven into the fabric of the world by the Norns, and their lives had meaning even if their names were not remembered in song. The conversion to Christianity brought profound changes. The old gods were declared demons or false idols. Temples were destroyed or converted into churches. Pagan practices were outlawed, though some persisted in secret or were absorbed into Christian rituals under new names. The process was gradual and uneven, varying from region to region. In some places, conversion was peaceful, a pragmatic decision by rulers who saw political and economic advantages in aligning with Christian Europe. In other places, it was violent, imposed by force, and old beliefs were driven underground. Iceland's conversion in the year 1000 was relatively peaceful, a compromise reached to avoid civil war, with the Althing voting to adopt Christianity as the official religion while initially allowing some private pagan practices. According to tradition, the law speaker who made the decision, a man named Thorgeir Ginnungagap, went away and lay under his cloak for a day and a night, thinking, and when he emerged, he announced that Iceland would be Christian, but that those who wished could still worship the old gods in private. Later, even these private practices were forbidden, and the old gods receded into memory. But memory is powerful, and the myths did not disappear. They lived on in poetry, in family stories, in the names of days and places. Tuesday is Tyr's Day. Wednesday is Odin's Day, from Woden, the Anglo-Saxon name for Odin. Thursday is Thor's Day. Friday is Freyja's Day. These names are spoken every day by people who no longer remember the gods they honor. The myths lived on in the sagas, in the literary culture of medieval Iceland, where even Christian writers used mythological references and motifs, because they were part of the shared language of storytelling. And the myths lived on in the manuscripts, carefully copied and preserved by scribes who recognized their value, even if they no longer believed in the gods described. In the centuries that followed, the myths were sometimes forgotten, sometimes misunderstood, sometimes romanticized beyond recognition. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical learning, but Norse mythology was not part of that revival, seen as barbaric and crude compared to the elegance of Greek and Roman myth. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, as nationalism swept Europe, scholars and artists began to look to the Norse myths as a source of cultural identity, particularly in Germany and Scandinavia. The myths were studied, translated, adapted, and sometimes distorted to serve political purposes. Richard Wagner drew on Norse and Germanic myths for his Ring cycle, creating an operatic epic that reimagined the gods and heroes in romantic terms. Scholars like the Brothers Grimm collected folklore and studied Old Norse literature, seeing in it the roots of German culture. And in the 20th century, the myths were again co-opted, twisted by Nazi ideology into propaganda for racial purity and martial strength, a misuse that has left lasting scars on how the myths are perceived. But the myths are larger and older than any of these uses. They predate nationalism and romanticism and ideology. They are stories from a specific time and place, shaped by the needs and beliefs of the people who told them, but they touch on themes that are universal: the search for meaning, the inevitability of death, the struggle between order and chaos, the value of courage and honor, the bonds of family and community, the longing for something beyond the everyday. They offer a way of looking at the world that is clear-eyed and unflinching, that does not pretend life is easy or fair, but that finds value in the struggle itself, in the act of standing up and fighting even when you know you will lose. In modern times, the myths have found new life in popular culture. They appear in comic books and movies, in novels and video games, often simplified or altered to fit contemporary tastes and narrative structures. Marvel's Thor is a superhero, far removed from the red-bearded god of thunder who drank an ocean and fought giants in a dress. Neil Gaiman's American Gods reimagines the Norse gods as immigrants in modern America, struggling to survive in a world that has forgotten them. Tolkien drew heavily on Norse mythology in creating Middle-earth, borrowing names and concepts and the sense of a world haunted by ancient dooms. These adaptations vary in quality and fidelity, but they serve a purpose, keeping the myths alive, introducing them to new audiences, ensuring that Thor and Odin and Loki and Freyja remain part of the cultural conversation. Scholars continue to study the myths, debating their meanings, tracing their origins, comparing them to other mythologies from around the world. They find parallels between Norse cosmology and the myths of other Indo-European cultures, suggesting shared roots deep in the past. They analyze the social and political contexts in which the myths were told, exploring how stories about gods reflected and shaped human society. They use archaeology and linguistics and comparative religion to fill in the gaps, to reconstruct beliefs and practices that were never written down. And they argue, constantly and passionately, about what the myths meant to the people who believed them and what they might mean to us today. What is clear is that the myths endure. They have survived conversion and censorship, misunderstanding and misuse, centuries of neglect and waves of reinterpretation. They survive because they are good stories, strange and compelling, full of characters who feel real despite their divine nature, full of moments that are funny or tragic or terrifying or all three at once. They survive because they speak to something deep in human experience, the awareness that we live in a world we do not fully control, that forces greater than ourselves shape our lives, that we are all walking toward endings we cannot avoid, and that what matters is how we walk that path. The story of Norse mythology is the story of a tree that holds the world together, its roots deep in the primordial past, its branches reaching into the future, beset by dragons and deer and decay, but still standing, still green, still alive. It is the story of gods who are not perfect, who make mistakes and love and hate and die, who face an ending they cannot prevent and go to meet it anyway, choosing courage over despair. It is the story of a world born from a giant's corpse, a world of ice and fire, of order carved out of chaos, beautiful and doomed and full of life. It is the story of humans who survive the end of everything, who emerge from hiding and look out over a green earth and choose to begin again. It is a story about endings and beginnings, about death and rebirth, about the cycle that never stops. And now, as we come to the end of our journey through the myths, as you lie in the darkness and feel sleep pulling at you, remember that the Norse believed the world was made of stories, that words had power, that memory was sacred. The gods are gone if they were ever here, but the stories remain, and as long as they are told, the tree stands, the worlds turn, and something of that strange northern vision endures. If you've enjoyed this long journey into the myths of the North, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Midnight Library. Let me know in the comments what you'd like to explore next, what other corners of history you'd like to wander through in the quiet hours before sleep. There are so many stories left to tell, so many forgotten places and distant times waiting to be rediscovered. But for now, rest. Let the weight of the day fall away. Let the stories wash over you like waves and drift into dreams, and know that morning will come and the sun will rise, just as it always has, just as the myths promised it would, even after the end of the world.